Welcome, Patreons, to the temporarily paywalled continuation of the main feed interview of Episode 3, You Can't Exile Anti-Fascism with Mark Bray. I'm really grateful for your support, and I hope this project brings you some joy and some hope and utility to your ears and to your works and days. Now, just to review part 1, Mark described keeping his public anti-fascist work and his private parenting life somewhat separate, but of course, he also talked about how his values inevitably shape how he raises his children, and that'll continue to be the case over the years. He described receiving threats and enduring intense media scrutiny back, 7 years ago while there was a new baby at home, and this prompted some thoughts about the painful trade-offs between parenting and resistance and endangerment. And then he added some nuance to my, idea that you can understand everything about fascism from schoolyard bullying analogy, because we were talking about early cultural conditioning and streams of propaganda in education, especially the, colonialism was bad, but form of liberal historical digestion. So here's part 2, and when I come back, I'll give some thoughts about the crucial distinction that Mark makes between conservative and right-wing histories of the world versus fascist histories. Spoiler, the content isn't all that different. It's the technique that marks the threshold. So I'll pick it up here after I ask a question about how liberal histories of social change often rely on individualistic and psychological analyses of heroic figures like MLK Jr., rather than accounts of longer-term struggles over class, power, and resources, and whether this reflects the misdiagnosis of fascism as being a constellation of personal failings versus being the consequence of structural pressures and injustices.
This kind of Western individualism finds its way into how we understand history, around thinking of MLK, for example, to use your reference, as this notable individual who had had enough and he put his foot down.
Right.
Or Rosa Parks, she decided to sit, in the front of the bus, but she was part of a campaign. These people were part of organizations. They learned from their elders who had been doing this for many years prior. And when it comes to that, then we think of politics in terms of individual moral conscience. And then that flips onto how we view fascists as these individuals who have a bad moral conscience.
Right.
And we don't see things in terms of struggle and power and movements and collectivities and interests. And that reflects how Americans see politicians. They don't, it would blow Americans' minds to really understand parliamentary systems where you vote for a slate of candidates.
I mean, I'm sitting here in Canada, so that's how we do it, and it is complete. Yes, it's completely different. The entire sort of dynamics of power is very much more sort of fluid, and I don't want to say collective, but definitely there are more moving parts and fewer celebrities.
Yeah, and while I don't think the solution to all of our problems is a parliament, as opposed to, but that having been said, though, I think that it's just an example to show how Americans think of political actors as people with ideas and opinions, not members of organizations or parties or, God forbid, classes.
Classes, right, exactly. Where do you think fascist propaganda becomes explicit in education? If we can talk about some examples there.
I think it becomes, well, again, I'm coming from this point of view where there are elements of continuity between what you would call straightforwardly fascist propaganda and politics and the broader ocean of right-wing centrist kind of reactionary ideas. There's a lot of overlap there, and so that's worth bearing in mind.
Right.
I think that where you can start to call it fascist is when it's completely divorced from sources. And so then that gets into the whole question of fake news and AI and deep fakes and everything that, for example, is critical of Trump is made up and is not real, and who's to say what's real. So I think that because fascism is a rejection of rationality at its foundation, which is hard for some people to wrap their minds around, because we all, I think, or many of us like to think of ourselves as working off of rationality, even if maybe we do that less than we think. But fascism emerged as what fascists considered to be this kind of virile, masculine rejection of what they perceived as kind of effeminate, Jewish, depending on the context, life-denying ways of thinking. Right. So Mussolini said, "I contradict myself. I don't give a damn." So if we think of it in an educational context, I think it's basically giving up on the question of sources, that the information is real based on an authority figure whose authority is not subject to question or justification. When it explicitly excludes a lot of people based on who they are, and also in other ways based on what they do and how they think. And it articulates kind of the basic, some version of the basic fascist confluence of ultra-nationalism and hierarchies around different forms of identity and nationality. When you kind of put all that together in the context of like, it doesn't need to justify itself, it just is. Then I think you've gone from a kind of like traditional conservative argument that, okay, like, for example, the colonization of North America was good because of X, Y, and Z. Once it becomes fascist, you don't need to do the X, Y, and Z. It's just good. And if you question it, you are the enemy.
Okay, so to make this concrete, I'm a 14-year-old boy in Catholic school in Toronto. I'm being propagandized to believe that colonization was simply something that happened, no big deal. And you're saying that that propaganda is pre-fascist if it is trying to be persuasive with facts and evidence. If I open my history book to, some chapter that covers the kind of flows of political power through that time, I can be reasonably sure that that book is going to be quoting from 19th century sources. It's going to be citing old documents. It's going to, in its liberal or conservative way, it's going to be trying to present a reasonable picture of reality, even though it's excluding voices of First Nations people, even though it's, blindered in a bunch of different ways. And even though the general sort of bias is to say, well, this happened and it's okay.
You could have a kind of version of American history that justifies colonization and leaves out just about everything about the genocide of the indigenous population that also has legitimate sources in it. And so I don't want to draw the lines in too sharp of a focus, but I do want to emphasize that there's elements of there's like spectrums between conservative and fascist, that is not always so sharp, that it's sometimes murky. And we can see that with the historical fascist movements where they started to really gain power when they started to win over the mainstream right. But I do think if we want to understand like some of at the level of ideas, what makes it fundamentally different, I think in this realm is partly around not even entertaining the game of winning the battle of ideas, or it's just expressions of power.
It seems to me like one of the biggest challenges faced by parents and caregivers is to recognize the tendency for mainstream society to respond to fascist threats with, liberal or centrist defenses. And so what that entails is the advice to young men to just keep working, for example, to follow the rules, to get good SAT scores, to vote Democrat, and eventually things will turn out all right. So is this something that you think about as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back to the earliest discussions around how to counter fascism. And there is the kind of centrist or liberal argument that you reinforce the institutions of democracy, you have faith in rational discourse to discredit fascist ideas, you have faith in the police, the court system, and then you have a more radical, or what I would argue is sincerely leftist position that sees fascism as a kind of egregious manifestation of what is already wrong with society. And argues for building a kind of there's various different versions of the argument, but basically like a mass working class anti-fascist movement that will hopefully stop fascism and hopefully then continue on to actually remake society in a more just direction. And so today we can see that those kinds of positions still exist. And I mean, I'm a radical myself, so I'm very critical of the kind of liberal anti-fascist formula, in part because of the historical precedent where Hitler and Mussolini came to power largely illegally,
Yeah.
and then used the apparatus of the liberal state for their fascist ends. And the power of the American state now is well greater than either of those states, and has in its surveillance capacities, its military capacities, and the degree to which it can to the degree it wants to operate almost kind of autonomously from civilian control in any meaningful sense, means that Trump has been handed a weapon that's perhaps unparalleled in human history, and that the Democrats have played a key role in making that happen. So those kinds of precedents make me, and my political outlook, make me very skeptical of the notion that all we need to do is abide by the rules. And we can see with Trump, and of course I'm an American, that's what's on my mind, right? We can see with Trump that he breaks the rules all the time. Once in a while, the courts will respond, 9 months, a year later, saying like, don't do that. But he knows the game. He knows how slowly the wheels turn. And it seems that he and his administration are really looking to society to see how much they can get away with. And when when he came into power, as someone who has read a bunch about fascism and is concerned about fascism, but doesn't want to be, let me take a step back. Yes, fascism is growing in the US, but it is not as fully developed as it could be, right? We still have a Democratic Party. We had the No Kings protest day. That was not shut down, right? It can get worse.
Right.
So I was trying to keep an eye when he came into power around some kinds of relatively historically informed gauges for seeing how this is going. And I could go on and on more about it, but one of the things I tried to keep in mind is the degree to which his administration tries to create parallel structures of power, because that was the main Nazi playbook. Was the concentration camp system was not illegal, but it was not legal in the sense that it was part of the traditional German state. It was outside of it. The SS was outside of it. And I think that with ICE and with sending detainees to El Salvador or Guantanamo, that is a step in that direction, that the administration is trying to make it sort of like that secret police concentration camp system. And that's great cause for concern.
It's a doubling of the government in a sense, actually. It's the creation of a parallel state that can act with impunity while sort of benefiting from the cover of the state that seems to be abiding by its own laws, but it really isn't.
Right. And that kind of normative state, the liberal state, still in the U.S. has some power to rein it in to a certain extent here and there. But it's that tension that I think is worth keeping in mind and recognizing that, with the decisions of the Supreme Court and so forth, that even the willingness of that liberal state to take much action, or the Democratic Party to take much action, is really something that you can't have faith in. Yeah, the only thing we can really turn to is popular resistance. And we've seen elements of that, but of course, I'd like to see more.
I want to turn now in the home stretch to notions of protest and direct action, because a lot of young anti-fascists are trying to figure out at this point, especially in the US as the police state grows, also in the UK, how they want to protest and speak out in public. So, one recent example from this past summer was at the Glastonbury Music Festival. A number of acts came under fire for shouting out anti-imperialist and anti-fascist slogans. And there was a British punk rap duo called Bob Villain that gave a long speech demanding an end to the genocide in Gaza. But the part that went viral was the lead singer leading tens of thousands of young people in a chant of death, death to the IDF. Now, is this a part of what might be culturally necessary to making anti-fascism more broadly understood and broadcast, and even more cool? And if so, what are the dangers inherent in that?
Yeah, well, first, I love Kneecap. I love Bob Villain. I really appreciate them speaking out. I like thinking of anti-fascism and Palestine solidarity work as being part of the same conversation. I think that's great. I've done some pro-Palestine activism on my campus over the last year, and what's happening, the genocide over there is really it's horrible, it's shocking, and it's so reprehensible how the Palestine exception makes it such that in the Western world it's not acknowledged.
I think there is the parallel when I think about anti-genocide and anti-fascism activism is that there is the notion of some kind of red line for cultural sanity or just the international conscience, that the phrase "no pasaran" or something like that applies in both circumstances, and that seems to be fuzzy for way too many people.
Without getting too far into it, yeah, the Palestine exception means that it seems almost as if the Israeli state can do whatever it wants to Palestinians, and it's still considered beyond the pale to criticize it. Yeah, a lot was made of the slogan "Death to the IDF." My understanding was that Bob Villain meant it in terms of like, yeah, the IDF is the focal point for engineering genocide. The IDF should not exist. How would people feel about a similar slogan about a similarly genocidal army? I think people would have more sympathy in other cases, right? Which again shows the Palestine exception.
I didn't even realize in preparing this question and thinking about that chant that the call is directed at an organization and not actually at individuals. It's almost like parallel to this question of should Israel exist?
I don't know whether they intended it as an organization or as individuals, but even so, I have no sympathy for individuals who are carrying out, just following orders by committing genocide. And there have been really great videos of young Israelis burning their draft cards or equivalent, going to prison for it.
Absolutely.
And they deserve all of our respect.
So let's do the same with other slogans that might come up in current protest culture that young people will hear and be moved by, but they might also want to consider very carefully before they start shouting them. Like they're easy, they can be thrilling to say, but sometimes not so easy to understand or even to assess in terms of strategy. So, one slogan would be "Abolish ICE." One would be, "All cops are bastards." And then returning to what we've been talking about, another phrase would be "Globalize the Intifada."
Yeah, well, people should definitely do research to understand. If you say something, you should know what it means, at least in a rudimentary sense.
Yeah.
And the right always, of course, likes to try to, do like walk around in the crowd and ask people what something means, and then find the handful of people who are confused and don't understand. And that, that's like a cheap game. Although, frankly, it's one that The Daily Show does in the other direction as well, right?
Right. Yes.
But that having been said, when you have a popular movement, there's always going to be people involved who have different degrees of knowledge or understanding or ability to articulate in front of a camera exactly what they think. And there's there's kind of an inevitability to that. I support all three of those slogans. That doesn't mean that there isn't also space for other kinds of rhetoric and propaganda that aims to meet people without familiarity with explicitly radical politics where they're at. Certainly, we should abolish ICE. I support open borders. So, this is kind of a non-starter for me. I don't think people should be put in cages just because they don't have the right papers.
Right.
I would like to create a world without police, which would also entail a kind of post-capitalist society where people have what they need and have a direct say in how their labor is used. And intifada is an Arabic term for resistance. That was popularized by the intifadas in Palestine, which involved all sorts of forms of resistance, strikes, boycotts, and armed resistance. And I think that kind of goes back to the earlier conversation, both around the Palestine exception and both around not seeing the history of Palestine in a broader anti-colonial history. All forms of anti-colonialism have had a variety of forms, from sit-ins to boycotts to protests to strikes to armed struggle. Palestine's no different. And I support all of those kinds of resistance against colonialism, which is the real bad guy always in all of this. And Intifada is a term for it, which I think has come to be associated in the Western mind as this kind of boogeyman, in part because of the kind of racist association between all things Muslim or Arabic. But resistance to occupation is legitimate. Resistance to genocide is legitimate. Yeah, I mean, I don't know why we even, it feels so self-evident to me, but obviously for many people it's not.
There's an argument that I will often hear that says, regardless of whether you agree with the content of a particular slogan, you have to be really, really concerned mostly about the fence sitters, about the people that you want to persuade, the people that you want to join your protest movement. You don't want to appear to be too radical. You don't want to suggest to the general population by shouting "globalize the Intifada" that somehow, as the ADL says, you must be a raging anti-Semite. So you should really worry about. You should almost do polling on how people will receive your particular slogan before going out on the limb with it. How do you feel about that part of the discourse? Because it's always very confusing to me.
Their polling was done around the sit-ins during the civil rights movement. It was done at the time.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of white Americans disapproved.
Disapproved of the sit-ins.
Of the sit-ins, right.
Right.
Right. So in that context, if you had just done polling, all right, you know what, civil rights activists, don't do sit-ins. It's viewed as aggressive.
Right.
The protest tactics that are at the cutting edge of resistance are never viewed favorably by a majority of people, but there's all these examples in history of them being successful. Part of that is that being successful does not always mean that you win people over.
Right.
Sometimes it's simply creating so much of a fuss that so many people want this problem to stop that they start looking to solutions. So one outlook of protest is to convince people, and obviously that would be ideal. Another is to create such a problem that it accentuates the need for an urgent solution. And often these things coexist in different ways. Now, going back to the protest slogan, I'm not so deluded as to think that your fence sitters in this example are going to hear a slogan without any kind of context or understanding of the politics behind it and suddenly be won over by it.
Right.
But then that's true. I think, though, that in a movement, you're always going to have a bunch of different groups, a bunch of different factions who are going to present ideas in different ways at different levels of explicit radicalism. That's inevitable. And I think that there are roles in every movement for forms of discourse and propaganda that really aim to get at people where they're at. With Occupy Wall Street, which I was involved with in New York City, we had different forms, like different papers, different journals, different accounts that kind of, some of them really tried to get at your person off the street who didn't have a lot of political knowledge, and others tried to really engage with people who have been activists for a number of years. I think every movement has to have that range in slogans, in actions, a way for everyone to plug in. The danger, if you try to make everything about reaching the fence sitter, is that essentially you exclude space for explicitly radical politics at all.
Right. And
you essentially turn a movement that perhaps has a radical potential to it towards the center. So, depending on what mood I'm in, I kind of vacillate a little bit as to where my point of gravity is here. But I think fundamentally I come back to there should be a diversity of forms of propaganda in every movement that can reach different people at different points. That shouldn't be at the expense of the presence of more fully formed radical articulations of what is wrong with the structure of society or what we should create in its stead.
If the more radical or militant forms of expression are eliminated, or if they're disciplined out of a particular movement, it doesn't seem to me like the actual sort of ideological strength of that movement will be sustained for very long, because usually the best ideas are the radical ideas.
Plus, also, if you study history, you can see it's always a moving target. Right. So if you get rid of the most radical articulation, then the problem will be the next most radical articulation, and so forth and so on, until ultimately.
Yeah. Right.
That's one of the problems I think, with left electoral politics can be the necessary horse trading involved, right? And that's inevitable. And then we can make arguments for and against the kind of benefits of it. But inherently, there's this impulse towards compromising towards some modicum of change and what gets left out in the process.
Last question. What makes you hopeful when you think about your kids in the context of all of this?
Yeah, that is hard. That is hard. And right. I don't know if you've seen, there's like a meme that's gone around of a roller coaster, and there are people going in who are people, and coming out, they're all skeletons.
Oh, no.
Anyway, I've seen it likened to like grad school. You go in and you're like, yeah, I'm going to learn. You come out. But that's sort of how I feel a little bit about having been involved in radical politics for 20 plus years. That sometimes it's hard to see all of the efforts that so many people have put in and how far we still are from where we want to go. That having been said, particularly over the last 10 or so years, there have been really amazing social movements and really amazing organizations created and gains. So it's hard for me sometimes that I want to present my children with all of the hope and sense of possibility that I had when I was 17.
Right.
And while I think there is wisdom to be gained from seeing the ups and downs, I don't want to let what is sometimes my emotional baggage get in their way. That I think that there's something gained by years of experience. I think there's also sometimes something's lost. And I saw that a little bit with Occupy Wall Street. When the encampment started in New York City, I was in my late 20s, but in activist terms, I was like almost an old man, right? Because the people that were doing this were predominantly younger. And at the time, I thought that they were naive. But I think that their lack of being burdened by the years of failure let them try something bold that ended up, relatively speaking, working. And so I think there's something for the young generations in having wisdom from older generations, but also not feeling tethered to it and letting themselves just sort of try their bold experiments. And I don't want to get in the way of that with all of my years of BS. So I guess my hopefulness is that the future is never written, that struggle continues, and that I hope they may live to see the kinds of outcomes that I dream of.
Mark Bray, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I really appreciated ending on that note. And the longer I've thought about this interview, the more this one particular part stands out. And I don't think it's in any of Mark's books that I'm aware of. And so perhaps he extemporized this. I'm not sure. It was where he said that the dividing line between conservative or right-wing knowledge production and fascist propaganda was the orientation the writer takes to facts and sources. You can build a story, as he said, of the US or Canada out of the colonial and nationalistic elements that fascists use. But if you stick to the books you typically get in high school or undergrad, unless you're in a post-colonial studies program that's super woke or something, you can put together a very reasonable, well-crafted essay or even book with a solid set of endnotes and a bibliography that makes you feel very smart. Now, if you put enough of those essays together, you can cash out with a normie degree. But as we know, that kind of well-written history can have countless problems with it in terms of what voices it ignores and which chapters it leaves out. So this is how we get Canadian history books that tell us almost nothing about the First Nations or how settlers genocided them or shipped them off to residential schools. And if you fast forward to today, it's the same impulse that gives us long, hand-wringing sermons about how complicated the situation is in Israel and Gaza, how it's an ancient battle between ancient foes, and we just don't know what to do. The pundit is drawing on all sorts of sources to legitimize their points, and none of them are Palestinian. You can be squarely ensconced in mainstream knowledge consumption and production and wind up thinking that the genocide of the First Nations people in North America was a messy business that we all just now have to live with, and that the genocide of Palestinians is regrettable, even terrible, but ultimately unstoppable because it's just too complicated. These end up being normal, everyday views. But here's the question. In terms of content, in terms of values and morality, how far are these views away from the views of fascists? Not very far, except for two differences. Fascists no longer pretend to care about historical suffering or inequality. And secondly, fascists don't feel any compulsion to pretend that they are telling the truth about history by using legitimate sources. So both the mainstream liberal centrist pundit and the fascist hold the same basic analysis of history, that capitalism and the global north-south order is just the way things are and the only way things could really be. The liberal centrist might get melancholic over the state of the world and inequality, while the fascist celebrates, but in the main, both support the basic logic of the system. Now, they do it in different ways, of course. The conservative, centrist, or liberal pundit wants to persuade you of the truth of their view, and they'll bring all the receipts they need to do it. If they have institutional prestige, all the better. This is what allows the New York Times to report on the assault on Gaza for 2 years as though it was a war. That's what's allowed them to take stories spoon-fed to them by the Israeli government to make it seem like the genocide was an inevitable outcome of Palestinian intransigence. They have a battery of historians and retired diplomats and other experts they can call on, all of them suspiciously in agreement. And then on the other side, the fascist side, the press is just holding up a megaphone for Stephen Miller to shout in. But ultimately, they are both saying, this is the way things must be. One is explaining and one is shouting. This is why, for me, one of the most disorienting aspects of Ezra Klein's long spiral into reactionary centrism was to watch him in short order, like in the space of a week, praise Charlie Kirk's political skills and then invite Ben Shapiro on his podcast to discuss where liberals and fascists could find common ground so that we can turn the temperature down on our discourse. Because when a guy like Klein does that, it's not just that he's demonstrating a real naivety with regard to what fascism is and whether you give it oxygen or not. What makes the encounters excruciating is that the search for common ground is a foregone conclusion. They don't have to work that part out because Klein and whatever MAGA influencer he's talking to are always going to agree that capitalism is the basic operating system of humanity and there's nothing to be done about that. So the difference between Klein and Kirk or Klein and Shapiro is that Klein really will try his hardest to plot the best way forward with data, polling, political theory, and moneyball strategies. He'll write a whole damn book to sell to the Democratic donor class. But on the other side of the table, Kirk and Shapiro are not burdened by the need for rationalism or even the need to look smart. All they have to do, all they are there for, is to exercise power, to own Ezra Klein, and to funnel their talking points straight to the White House. And somehow Klein doesn't get it. Maybe he doesn't want to get it or need to get it because his job is not about politics. It's about talking about politics. So as you can see, this remark from Mark really made an impression on me because one of the most disturbing aspects of working in this disinformation space over the past 5 years is this nebulous feeling that some information is rational and well supported while other forms of information isn't. And while that's true in many regards, when you look more closely, you realize that between the two sources, the actual content and messaging is pretty much the same. Now, in my particular field, this showed up in a mind-bending inconsistency between being able to investigate disinformation, put out by QAnon and MAGA versus the inability to apply the same investigative standards to Israeli Hasbara. After October the 7th, I watched a big chunk of the disinfo space either fall silent on Gaza or actively repeat Hasbara talking points. Now, why was that? Because in the end, the liberal Democrats who can do such a good job in battling the epistemological sins of the MAGA movement, they essentially agree with U.S. foreign policy and with MAGA attitudes on Israel. And this incentivizes unequal attention paid to the disinformation that keeps the global status quo spinning on its axis. Okay, enough of that. I want to close out this episode by closing my eyes and thinking about Mark Bray's kids and all of the kids of anti-fascist or exiled or oppressed people out there. And I want to think about how their parents have to create adventures out of hardship while knowing that eventually those kids will become aware of that hardship. They'll know the story. I would like to think about how parents have to work at this impossible equation to balance giving their kids safety versus giving them awareness, and how the transition from innocence to knowledge is always really hard and only made possible by love. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you back here. Peace and courage to you and yours.